The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone. We've got a few people still rolling in, but I don't want to delay us too long, so we'll wait another minute to get started. I will remind you that if you have any questions, you can submit them through the chat box within the webinar tool. And we will receive those on our end, and our speaker today can answer them at the end of the session. And also, this webinar will be available afterwards. We are recording it today. All right, I think we're good to get started. As I said, thank you all for participating in this Computer Measurement Group webinar. Today's event is why COBOL still makes sense in the age of digital transformation. Our partner today is GT Software. They provide enterprise software solutions that revolutionize data access, process, and transaction access to optimize business information across mainframe, distributed, and cloud platforms. And I'm very excited to present our speaker today, Walter Sweat. Walter is one of GT Software's technical architects and is a 40-year seasoned veteran working on mainframe applications as well as mainframe migration and modernization projects. Besides GT Software, Walter has worked for Fortune 500 companies such as Home Depot, Napa Automotive Parts, Ashland Chemical, and Dell. His expertise centers on finding ways to help companies retain their mainframe functionality as they transition to more agile open systems and allowing those companies to see better performance at a lower cost. He also has experience in helping companies re-architect their mainframe environment, taking advantage of the capabilities of more flexible hardware and software solutions. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Walter. Thank you so much for being here.
Amanda, thank you so very much. And thank you all for taking the time to join us today. We're going to spend about an hour talking about one of my favorite topics, and that's COBOL. I've been working with COBOL in one shape, form, or fashion since about 1974, and quite honestly, I like it even more today than I did back then. And I also want to spend some time talking to you specifically about how COBOL can be the springboard to help you digitally transform your organization. I'm going to be using Fujitsu's NetCOBOL as an example, as we here at GT Software are the worldwide distributor for NetCOBOL. And in all honesty, I've found it to be the most rock solid of all the COBOLs I've ever used. And it offers some exciting technologies specifically geared to help companies focused on digital transformation. So let's start with what digital transformation really is. If you go look on the web, you can find dozens of definitions, but a consensus statement I feel would be that, as it says here, digital transformation is the reworking of the products, processes, and strategies obtained by leveraging current technologies, of which, of course, COBOL is one. There are several major areas in which organizations see the benefit of digital transformation. And what I'd like to do is detail those here so we can use them as a reference point as we talk more specifically about COBOL. First, there's the topic of customer understanding. Whether it's a better understanding of customer data analytics or a better understanding of information on social media, understanding what your customers feel is paramount to being on the edge of digital transformation. Excuse me. Another topic is customer touch points, and that can relate to using technologies like mobile or cloud to present your organization in the best way possible. In terms of worker enablement, allowing your own legacy teams the ability to integrate with all elements of your development organization, and thus doing that by providing the same set of tools, helps to ensure that you are positioned to be more agile. Excuse me. And understanding emerging customer demands is often related to the idea of big data and analytics. trying to capture the essence of what your customer base is feeling. Customer visibility is obviously critical. If a customer doesn't know who you are, they can't buy from you. Providing better options to get your information available, like in the cloud, allows customers to find you more easily. And an interesting topic for me is process digitization. And that's where the processes of technology are more automated, kind of allowing you to get to market faster and to be more responsive. And I'm very much convinced that globalization is the way of the future, and it's especially important from a financial perspective. So I'd like to spend the rest of our time here together today talking about how COBOL, and in the sample we're using, NetCOBOL, helps organizations become digitally transformed. So to start, I'd just like to offer my opinion that indeed COBOL can be a tool that takes an organization with its past into that digitally transformed future. What I'm sure you would ask then is, so what? Why is that important to me? Well, the reason I think it's important is that even though people have been saying COBOL is dying for the last 15 years, it's still not only around, but as much in use as ever. And for companies who have invested in COBOL, whose business rules are contained in that COBOL code, I would suggest that COBOL, since it contains the business rules that are in place today, is the perfect starting point to help you digitally transform yourself to where you want to go as an organization. As people say about all sorts of things, this isn't your father's or grandfather's COBOL that's in use today, that COBOL that I started with so long ago. It truly can be and is an agile language. And COBOL was designed to process data, lots and lots of data, and it's every bit as effective in doing that today as it ever was. And as evidenced by every time you go on the internet, there are increasing levels of data that need to be processed in today's world. And NetCOBOL, and COBOL in general, with its ability to handle big data, is still a very powerful tool to use. So I'm going to make an assumption that since you're sitting in on this webinar, that you perhaps do or have done some COBOL programming in your life. And unless you, Chuck Norris, happen to be part of this audience, I'm going to guess that the more tools you had in place to help in doing that programming helped much more than just staring at the screen. In today's computing environment especially, that ability to have effective and agile tools is really paramount. We all have to be concerned about things that we never would have dreamed of when we first started programming with COBOL, I think. The ability to access web data, to provide capabilities for mobile devices to access and use your applications, the need to access web services, the need to develop programs quicker and more securely. All of those things are the challenges that both the CIO and the developer face today. And the ways that you address all of those topics helps you move to that digitally transformed world. So first, for those who haven't heard of NetCOBOL before, I'd like to take a few moments to explain why that Fujitsu NetCOBOL, what it is and where it came from. And even more importantly, I want to explain how it's offering transformation capabilities to organizations today. For those of you who've ever heard of AMDAL, way back in the day, they had a mainframe COBOL compiler back in the early 70s when Fujitsu first started partnering with AMDAL. That compiler stayed in existence up through the issuance of the COBOL 85 standards, and then led to a standalone product in 1972 called COBOL G. Well, from there, the COBOL transitioned as Fujitsu started to take control after their acquisition of AMDAL into Power COBOL. And then in around 2002, NetCOBOL came into existence. And technology that is in place with the newest versions of NetCOBOL, like usage of the Fujitsu Cloud Services K5, are definitely a part of a digitally transformed environment. I mentioned the cloud services. Cloud Service K5 is a next generation cloud platform, and it's specifically created to enable efficient and easy and cost-effective enterprise level digital transformation. And there's some benefits of K5 that I think are important. It's a universal platform. It helps to consolidate workloads to increase operational efficiency. It's an open platform maximizing interoperability. and it offers an integration of legacy systems with new technology, thus saving money. Another topic on this screen that relates to digital transformation is the Hadoop interface in NetCOBOL for Linux, as that provides a pathway to working with big data in areas like data analytics. We'll talk about how those types of new advances in COBOL very much help companies to digitally transform themselves as we go through the rest of the presentation. So as I mentioned ago, NetCOBOL has been around for a long time, with its origins being back part of that original Amdahl COBOL compiler. Fujitsu has extended that compiler to work in multiple environments. And as opposed to what some other COBOL providers have done, which is kind of to follow that Java development paradigm of developing once and deploying anywhere, Fujitsu has been focused on performance and offering what I think is production-ready critical alternatives for their compilers. So instead of writing a compiler that has to handle all the nuances of all the possible operating environments, the Fujitsu compilers are geared to work at optimum efficiency and performance for the environment for which they specifically were built. That means if you want to work with .NET, you don't have to worry about extraneous requirements that would be necessary to put into a Linux compiler. Bottom line, NetCOBOL has efficient compilers and runtimes for .NET environment, Windows, Linux, and Solaris environments as well. So I mentioned before that I could understand that you might ask, so why should I care about COBOL and NetCOBOL when I'm talking about digital transformation? Well, I would suggest that there are really four major reasons, whether you care about the financial aspects or the technical aspects of using COBOL, that make sure that NetCOBOL is the right language moving forward for many of you, hopefully. And all of those reasons are part of the topics about digital transformation that we saw in the initial slide. There's been a discussion going on for at least the last 15 years or so about which is the right development environment for people. Is it Unix, Linux, or Windows.NET? Well, my opinion is that there is no single right answer, as truly everyone's needs are indeed different. With NetCOBOL, you have those four major categories of operating environment covered. And that flexibility in having those environments is a component of one of the things we talked about when we talked about digital transformation, and that's worker enablement. The fact that NetCOBOL, as opposed to most of the other COBOL suppliers in the market, that they don't cause you to incur runtime fees is a huge differentiator. And that's definitely a part of the globalization topic we mentioned earlier. Cloud, as we all know, is such a major topic of discussion now. Now, I kind of feel that 5 years ago, people wanted a COBOL supplier to have cloud really as an option, just as a ticking mark to say that it was available. But now people are actively and truly deploying to the cloud, and it's a reality of so much of future development to come, I think. Well, NetCOBOL has been cloud enabled for years, and that obviously helps address the topics of customer visibility and globalization. And Fujitsu continues to push the envelope and offer additions to NetCOBOL to help our users stay in front of the game. It's Fujitsu's and our goal to ensure that our customers can indeed depend on COBOL in their future. So as we talked about the major areas of digital transformation, we can see these four topics address specifically, I hope, the topics of globalization with runtime fee controlment and interfaces with cloud technology, worker enablement via the multiple development environments, and we'll discuss the other areas when we get back to talking later about some of the exciting new features that now exist in COBOL. So depending on the platform and which is the optimum one for you, NetCOBOL offers solid development environments. For those customers who have an affinity to use .NET, we interface with all of the versions of Visual Studio up to and including Visual Studio 2017. For our Linux customers, we provide an Eclipse plugin that allows those customers to take advantage of the ability to develop, compile, deploy, and debug their programs in a standard environment that can also be used for other language development in Linux. Our native Windows customers have the option of using that same Eclipse capability, or to use our native project manager tool that allows them to also do development, compiling, and debugging. And for our heavy production Solaris customers, they have the ability to utilize command line compiler utilities to ensure that their production critical applications are developed and deployed most efficiently. So I think in terms of benefits, a good question is obviously, why does it matter that we offer these development environments? From a financial perspective, offering the ability to make your developers able to integrate with other in-house development teams, whether they're doing development in C or C++ or C# or any other language, means that applications can be developed more quickly, helping the return on investment for that development effort. And to me, that's a prime example of one of the topics we talked about before, worker enablement. I don't know how many of you encounter this situation, but I run into it all the time with COBOL customers. What seems to happen a lot is that what was a 100% COBOL development shop for years sometimes starts to branch out and use different languages as they encounter newer challenges and opportunities. Just as there is no one right tool for every job, I got a hammer, so I need a nail. Sometimes a particular business problem is best handled by programming a solution in a language that just isn't COBOL. So many of our customers do have cross-platform environments, and the one thing I hear consistently is that it can be really hard to get the different languages to talk to each other. People are using different development and debugging environments, so it's hard to have a consistent attack plan when apps written in two different languages need to talk to each other. And that doesn't even take into account different data types. I'm willing to bet all I need to do is mention Comp3 data to someone who's had to provide COBOL data to a non-COBOL partner to have them understand that there can indeed be challenges in working cross-platform together. So again, to me, this capability addresses directly the topic of worker enablement in the discussion of digital transformation. So let's take a look at some of these options. I feel Microsoft has done a wonderful job of handling the situations we talked about for those companies who lean toward Windows solutions with their Visual Studio environment. No matter the language used, the developers all use the same UI for development and debugging. And to be able to follow in the same debugger a COBOL program calling a C# program or a VB.NET program calling a COBOL program is a huge help. And NetCOBOL for .NET is in fact a true .NET language, just like C# and VB.NET. It understands .NET data types. It generates the same kind of executable code as those other languages. And to me, most importantly, it's designed to take advantage of the Visual Studio development environment. As you can see from this screenshot, you have a powerful editor where you can do things like see how data items are defined by just hovering over their name, wherever they happen to be referenced in the program. You can add watch values so that you can see data values change as you step through the program's execution. You can click on a copybook and have it opened up for you in a completely different window. All of these things help a COBOL developer make that transition to a new environment that much easier, back to worker enablement again. Similarly, NetCOBOL working inside of Visual Studio allows developers to work on multi-language solutions all in one environment. In this screenshot, you can see a single solution that has both a NetCOBOL for .NET project working right alongside a C# project. Where this really comes into play is when you start to debug the entire application and can just seamlessly move from one language type or project to the next, kind of following the data path as you go along. To me, what this allows a developer to do is to use the best language for each situation where it makes sense. If I were going to be writing an application that needed to process, I don't know, millions of scalar data points in memory, I probably wouldn't want to do that in COBOL, since that's something that a language like C# is well designed for. But if I also had to manipulate millions of records and sort them in order to get those data points, I might like to do that in COBOL and then just pass the data along to the C# application. To me, that's why NetCOBOL, being a true .NET language, is so important. And another thing that's very powerful about NetCOBOL for .NET inside of Visual Studio is you can take advantage of tools like code snippets. So if you have lots of places where you use the same type code, but there are different variable names that need to be replaced in each section, instead of handwriting that or doing a copy and paste, then having to go back and hopefully remember to change each applicable data name, you can use code snippets to create these macros for yourself that give you that very powerful capability to do mass changes. And code snippets are extensible, so you can create as many as you want. And this is, to me, a prime example of process digitization, where the automation of effort helps to speed that path to market. I think the same concept exists for creating new programs from scratch. If you're like me, even though I've been doing COBOL development for 40 years, I can never, ever remember what order those darn sections come in. So I've probably modified the first COBOL program I ever wrote about 30,000 times so that I don't have to remember how to write a COBOL program from scratch. Well, NetCOBOL for .NET with Visual Studio extends that capability for me automatically. If I work with a customer who has a lot of standard routines that they want all of their developers to use, they can just create their own code template so that all developers start out with a basic core application that is 100% consistent. I think this is especially helpful when you're working with items like standardized I/O routines or error processing routines. And just as we talked about with code snippets, you can create as many of those templates as you need and have them available to all of your developers consistently. Another example, in my opinion, IntelliSense. It's one of the coolest features ever, and it's one that C# and VB.NET developers have been able to take advantage of for many years. Now that NetCOBOL for .NET is a true .NET language, that means that you, as a COBOL developer, get that same benefit. If you're like me and spell perform as perform every single time, the IntelliSense color coding immediately lets me know that I have a typo. And as we see in the example on the screen, IntelliSense lets you type just the first part of a word, and then it'll fill in the rest for you. And if the verb you're typing has a required format, like a perform varying command has, it'll remind you to make a valid code construct for the command. Trust me, once you start to use IntelliSense, if you haven't before, you'll never want to be without it. And all of these topics have to do with that worker enablement, being able to provide environments that developers can work in to help optimize their effort to get their code and applications to market quicker. I'm not sure if you've ever had the need to have a different development language read one of your COBOL data files, but it can be really, really difficult. And that's really just if you're looking to have a program written in a different language read a COBOL sequential file. I probably don't have to tell you, but imagine how much harder it is if you want that foreign program to read an index file. Well, in our case, talking about NetCOBOL, Fujitsu provides a set of COBOL file APIs for their file system so that you can have a C# or a VB.NET program directly control your sequential, random, and index files. So rather than having to write intermediary programs to pull data out to a vanilla format that can be read by a program written in a different language, you can now have those programs directly access that data via those APIs. And that can be a huge time saver for you, and really it helps lower risk and that those intermediary programs might not be presenting the data correctly. You're guaranteed no risk with this solution. And being able to have different languages access that historic legacy data helps in the area of emerging customer demands, I think, as it provides access for analytics to use that data to best understand what your customers are expecting. It's all about availability and understanding that customer environment that these new tools help in. Well, we talked about the ability to use Visual Studio with NetCOBOL for .NET so that you can all have your developers using the same development platform. But as I mentioned before, not everyone wants to work in a .NET world. Many people are really sold on using the Eclipse platform for doing multi-language development. And NetCOBOL for Linux and NetCOBOL for Windows both support that methodology. For those who don't know, Eclipse is an integrated development environment, an IDE, and it's the most widely used Java IDE. Just as Visual Studio gives the ability for developers using different programming languages to use the same IDE, Eclipse does the same in the non.NET world. As you can see, the structure is somewhat akin to what we saw with our Visual Studio example. There's a code editor, and there are functions that allow compilation, deployment, and debugging from within Eclipse. While you can do development on a Windows machine in order to take advantage of the graphical capabilities for ease of use, what happens most often in these heavy production server environments, I feel, is that those applications that are developed on those Windows machines will be deployed to a server environment. In this example, we're setting up to do remote development, and that's where we'll write an application on our Windows computer and then deploy it to our Linux server. As you can see, all we have to do is select which server to which we want to deploy, and then select the directory where the source files will be sent. So it gives our developers the ability to use the best tool possible for development and then to run in the best operating environment for the particular application. Once we've identified the server, we can actually have the Eclipse plugin and NetCOBOL transfer the source files directly to the Linux server where they'll be compiled once again. This comes after we've been able to do all the testing of the application on our Windows development box. And that helps ensure that we aren't impacting data on the Linux server or any other users who are deploying applications to that server. Once we have the developed application deployed to the Linux server, we can set up our debugging parameters and actually debug that application. As you can see from the settings, there are actually two kinds of debugging that you can do in these environments. You can do what is called normal debugging, where you start the application on the Linux server directly from your Windows machine. And then if necessary, you can use a tool like PuTTY to be signed onto that Linux server, where you'll interact with the application if there's any user interface to the program. Every time you reach a breakpoint, you can follow along the program's logic path with the graphical editor on your Windows machine, making your developers more efficient. The other kind of debugging session you can do is shown with the options for attach debug. In that scenario, you set up debugging parameters on the Linux server and start the application from there. The running application is told to which debugging session to attach, and a connection is made from the Linux machine running that application back to your Windows machine, where you can follow along again with the program logic as you debug that app. Again, all of these development and debugging environments are geared to help make your applications get to market quicker and to be more responsive. So here's an example of a normal debug session where I've started the application on the Linux server directly from my Windows graphical environment. Once that program started, I can do all the things you would expect to be able to do, like setting breakpoints, adding watch values, and changing values of data items as I step through that program. From an architectural point of view, this slide shows how development and deployment is set up for a Linux development platform and alternatively from a Windows platform as well. In this case, each developer has a copy of NetCOBOL for Windows on their own Windows machine, and the Linux or Windows server has a copy of the NetCOBOL for Linux or NetCOBOL for Windows compiler as well. The important thing here is that no matter how many users you have using the developed application, there's no extra charge for running those developed programs on either of the server environments. And that's a huge difference from what you see with other COBOL development options that exist in the market today. And from our perspective, from this webinar today, being able to expedite the process of debugging applications allows quicker development and helps that in that process of process digitization. I mentioned that we use Eclipse in doing development for a Linux environment, and then we can also use it for Windows development, with the only difference being whether we deploy to a Linux server or to a Windows server. However, not everyone wants to use Eclipse, so for people who are working with Windows and not .NET, we also provide what we call our Project Manager development platform. Just as with Visual Studio and Eclipse, this platform allows and offers a developer the ability to use a COBOL editor for development, compilation, and debugging the application. And this is just one more alternative that people can use based on their own preferences. As you can see, this is pretty straightforward, yet it's an easy to use development environment. So whether you're doing development, debugging, or deploying your application, I hope that, it's the environments you work in, that they would match what mine have been with using an environment like this, that it's easy to learn, easy to use, and it's an extremely powerful COBOL option. All right, back to other topics. One of the 4 benefits that I mentioned back at the beginning of this presentation related to economics. Well, NetCOBOL is pretty unique in that it doesn't charge user runtime fees. We just never thought it made sense to charge a user for the right to run a program that was developed with our COBOL compiler. If you develop a program in C or C++ or C# using the Microsoft compilers, you don't have to pay Microsoft the fee for every user who runs programs written in those languages. However, in the COBOL space, that's not often the case. Many providers not only charge for the development platform, just like the compilers for which we also charge developers, but also every user who uses a program developed with that compiler is charged a runtime or right-to-use fee. If you just have one user, perhaps it isn't a big deal. But to me, as applications become more successful and more widely used, one user often becomes dozens or hundreds of users. And if an application becomes extremely successful and is used by users all over the world, there's obviously a huge economic benefit in not having to pay runtimes. And in terms of the transformation topic of globalization, being able to deploy quicker and easier where the demand is, well, that's a huge benefit to any organization. It not only controls costs, but allows organizations to be, I think, more fluid in their responses to customer needs. So as opposed to users of Fujitsu's NetCOBOL, where there's never a runtime fee charge, other providers of COBOL in this market do charge for the rights of users to run programs compiled and deployed with their compiler. As an example, here's some real-world charges of which I've heard where companies have had to pay for those runtime charges. For a single user, there are COBOL providers who would charge runtime fees of up to $300 per user, and there would also be a requirement to pay ongoing maintenance fees for those runtimes in subsequent years. Where it really starts to add up is when you have dozens or hundreds of users who might be perhaps running on a quad-core server. In that case, it would not at all be surprising to see those companies having to fork over around $40,000 in runtime fees. And where it gets really expensive is when you might have thousands of users working on servers where maybe there are 10 cores and the cost could exceed $150,000. And it only really goes up from there when you're talking about huge web applications running on server farms. And amazingly to me, some providers also charge separate runtime fees for test servers above and beyond the cost for production server runtime fees. So that's why we feel that the NetCOBOL products offer such a good economic choice for so many customers and gives those companies more flexibility in being able to address the transformation topic of globalization. So for this economic benefit of no runtime fees, how can we actually see that benefit? Well, to me, from a business perspective, it's really pretty linear. If you count the number of users who use the programs developed by your COBOL developers, the money that you no longer have to pay in runtime fees either goes to your bottom line or it can be reinvested in tools for your development teams. Also, one of the challenges that many companies have faced when working with COBOL providers who do charge runtime fees, well, it's the possibility of audits over exactly who the users of those applications are. If you do a Google search of COBOL audit lawsuits, you can see that some of these lawsuits have reached into the tens of millions of dollars for very large corporations. And then for the development team, not having to keep up with exact information about who every user of an application is frees them to do what they do best, work on developing quality code. Early on, I also mentioned as one of the 4 benefits of NetCOBOL that it has for years been cloud enabled, and not just by running a COBOL app as an IaaS service in a cloud deployment. NetCOBOL can take advantage of true Microsoft cloud services. And being able to easily interface with SQL Azure is a huge benefit of being able to allocate data to where it makes the most technical and economic sense. For all other services which are not natively attached, the fact that NetCOBOL for .NET is a true .NET language means that you can take advantage of the .NET Azure SDK just as you could if you were working with C# or VB.NET. And the fact that you can use either Microsoft Azure or Fujitsu's own K5 cloud service means that you have the ability to better control the areas of customer touch points and customer visibility from a digital transformation perspective. In terms of benefits, well, for the CIO, the ability to deploy to the cloud is a huge boon. Not having to do a vertical deployment, but being able to scale applications horizontally to fully accommodate issues like seasonal peak loads, it's a huge benefit. And for the development team, being able to share deployment of a COBOL application with your cloud deployed web applications, it becomes seamless. And you can take advantage of what access to SQL for Azure, for instance, gives you. Making all of this scalability and functionality more easy, well, is the fact that you don't have to worry about licensing for runtimes in the cloud, since again, NetCOBOL never charges for runtimes. Now, for the fun stuff, for a benefit that especially has me excited, I mentioned that the Fujitsu development team continues to push the envelope in terms of new functionality, and I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about some of the ones that I think are the coolest in our newest NetCOBOL for .NET and NetCOBOL for Linux versions. IBM LE routines, in case you haven't heard of them, are a component of IBM's COBOL, and they really represent a standard set of runtime callable functions that, in essence, make up a common set of very flexible runtime components. Years ago, every IBM language, whether it was COBOL, PL1, Assembler, etc., all had their own runtime ways of doing certain things. Well, IBM changed that so those languages could all share the same runtime components and make interoperability easier. With NetCOBOL for .NET now, our users get the benefit of using those same function calls. A normal function of .NET languages for years has been the ability to provide pretty much what I call self-documenting features in their code to ensure a consistent, easy-to-use documentation method. NetCOBOL for .NET now also offers that ability. Using standard proven functions that have already been written has been a component also of the .NET language for years by taking advantage of the .NET framework. Well, Microsoft has now extended that to not only use the program features in the .NET framework, but also to be able to pull in complete application environments that other companies have already written, which you can now use. This is a huge opportunity for your development teams to be able to get to market faster. And NetCOBOL now integrates with Visual Studio to offer that capability with their accessibility to the NuGet distribution packages. And we'll talk about that a little more in a moment. Everyone has heard of big data and ensuring accessibility to it. And with NetCOBOL for Linux's Hadoop interface, our users now have that capability. So let's take a look at each of those four new areas for a moment, as that's where we'll see an interface to some of the other major components of digital transformation that we mentioned earlier. First, as I mentioned, LE subroutines are standard calls provided by IBM and now also provided by NetCOBOL, which allows you to do things that are not so easily done in just pure COBOL, I feel. What I used to call bit fiddling, things like extended date time routine processing, items like algebraic mathematics and message processing, not to mention being able to use country-wise language routines, could be very time-consuming to develop and test with standard COBOL. With the introduction of the LE subroutines with NetCOBOL for .NET, those features are now much easier to incorporate into your applications, and they can be implemented in a low-risk, high rate of time return using the LE services. To me, directly, this area is a prime example of process digitization and worker enablement. Being able to select where in your programs you want standard documentation placed without having to go through the effort of writing that documentation and ensuring that it's consistently used can be a huge benefit. As we can see from this slide, by just entering in a comment line in a strategic place in your program, as shown on the panel on the left, NetCOBOL can then add in the appropriate system level documentation for you. Notice that in the panel on the right, excuse me, that the documentation, the comment lines that are generated include things like what the input parameters for the linkage section might be. And this is a place where if we incorporate the code templates that we talked about earlier with this XML documentation, you can ensure that you have very consistent documentation generated. By automating these documentation processes, we can assist an organization with process digitization, expediting that process of ensuring that the applications remain agile and well-defined. One of my favorite new features for NetCOBOL is the incorporation of the NuGet packages into Visual Studio and its interface with NetCOBOL. In case you haven't heard of it, NuGet is the package manager for the Microsoft development platform, including .NET. The NuGet client tools provide the ability to produce and consume packages. So NuGet is a free and open source package manager designed for that Microsoft development platform, and it really serves as a larger ecosystem of both tools and services. In other words, it pretty much offers free access to solid, proven applications and routines that other people have already written. As an example, in the panel on the left, we see NuGet in operation inside of Visual Studio. We're in a NetCOBOL project. I've gone out to look in the NuGet repository for an application that fits my needs. That might be a standard module where I could perhaps convert a report to a PDF document without having to write any of the logic to do that. Another example of one of the thousands of packages that are out there that I think is really cool is the UWP Community Toolkit provided directly by Microsoft. As shown in the panel on the right, you can see the type of programmability that is just directly available to use, like, for instance, having your COBOL application directly do queries of the Bing search engine. I mean, that's just seriously cool, I think. Without having to know anything about how to use Bing as a search tool programmatically, I can incorporate those type of searches into my COBOL app. That's a prime example of making COBOL the language that still works for us all tomorrow and next year and 20 years from now. To me, this is a major influencer on the transformation topics of customer visibility and customer touch points, being able to tie in things like Bing search, Twitter, and LinkedIn to a COBOL application. Big data is big business, and it's a terribly important topic, obviously. According to Wikipedia, big data is a term for data sets that are so large or complex that traditional data processing application software, well, it's just inadequate to deal with them. When you combine the storage and processing of that data, along with the other hot topic of today and tomorrow, analytics, it's easy to see why big data is a topic important to many organizations. With our newest version of NetCOBOL for Linux and its Hadoop interface, NetCOBOL now supports handling of big data in a way that makes economic and functional sense, I feel. It allows those large masses of data to be spread out amongst multiple lower cost servers using parallel processing. It also offers another benefit that's a hot topic today, high availability. Ensuring that data is up and available at all times, with the reality of how much data is accumulated every single day now, well, it's a way of life for organizations. And as with the other topics we just discussed, I think it's kind of cool that COBOL is right in the middle of providing today's and tomorrow's capabilities. Obviously, by providing a big data interface, NetCOBOL addresses that transformation topic of customer understanding as well as emerging customer demands, also as well as globalization. So kind of to summarize, in terms of those new features and what those benefits really mean, I think there are several really important items to consider. Being able to scale to need, whether with a Hadoop processing or cloud deployment, makes it easier to control costs. Being able to not have runtime fees means you can scale up as many deployment environments as makes sense for you. Some of the tools like NuGet packaging mean your development teams are not spending time inventing something that already exists and is guaranteed to work. And all of those items contribute, obviously, to lower risk for your organization. And from a technical perspective, I hope we've been able to show that NetCOBOL does offer a very feature-rich development environment, no matter what platform makes the most sense for you to work in. Features like self-documentation, when it's so hard to ever find time to document your applications, is something that many companies have seen immediate benefit from. Being able to use routines guaranteed to work, whether from the .NET framework or the NuGet packaging, means you get to market quicker. And being able to handle data, whether through SQL Azure or a big data interface like Hadoop, is obviously a huge requirement in today's marketplace. So to me, the bottom line is that these new development tools do indeed allow companies to be more in control of the way their digital footprint helps them be prepared to move to the future, allowing themselves to transform their technologies based on the business rules that still help define who they are, taking what was into the past into the future. So with that, let's see if there are any questions. Amanda, have we had any questions submitted during the presentation that I can address?
I'm reviewing those right now. I do have one question for you to get started, and that is, will NetCOBOL work with source control software?
Great question. And yes, absolutely it will. No matter the platform that you're working in, NetCOBOL is designed to be very agnostic. So whether you're using something like Team Foundation Server or CSS, NetCOBOL plugs directly into those just as any other language does.
Okay, great. How often do releases of NetCOBOL come out?
Oh, what an interesting question. And I'll tell you why I think that's an interesting question. I've worked for other COBOL compiler companies over the years, and some of them were, I will say, always on the bleeding edge, and there were new releases and new updates 4 and 5 and 6 times a year. And while that can be a nice thing as you're looking to add new features, I think it's kind of important for us to remember that Fujitsu, a huge $45 billion Japanese conglomerate, has a real devotion to quality and control. For me, the NetCOBOL compiler is the most rock solid, best performing COBOL compiler and runtime I've ever worked with. And part of that is when they introduce a new release, it's ready to go on day one. So you might see a new version of NetCOBOL for each of the platforms that we've talked about every year to every 15 months with one minor release in between. The good news is that with so many organizations, those minor releases are bug fixes, and we just don't see that with Fujitsu. That's why we here at GT Software are so sold on being their partner.
Great. And do you have the ability to move ISAM data to SQL Server with NetCOBOL?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so the ISAM data that exists, or people coming on from the mainframe would call it VSAM data as well, same sort of thing, just means index data. With NetCOBOL itself, we support the concept of working with SQL data where you use embedded SQL. What we've tried to do in our partnership with Fujitsu is provide tools that will do that for you. So we happen to have a tool called NeoData that will allow people who wish to get to a relational model, who are today in an index model, be able to do that without rewriting any of their code at all. So the same COBOL reads and writes are actually reading and writing data back and forth to SQL Server. So the answer is Fujitsu by itself doesn't provide that, but we hope we and our partnership with them do provide that. Hope that answered the question okay.
All right. there are any last questions, you can send them into chat. But Walter, I want to thank you so much for this great presentation. I think it really helped show how you can utilize these new technologies that it will help save some costs and streamline your business.
Oh, Amanda, it was my pleasure. I'd like to take just one quick second, since I didn't get a chance to talk about who GT Software is. We talked about COBOL and digital transformation, but just a little plug real quick. We're an Atlanta-based company with over 30 years of experience, and we hope expertise in providing real-time mainframe integration and migration solutions. We have a broad base of customers worldwide that use our technologies in very mission-critical business applications. And we continue to focus on how to help organizations take advantage of combining their legacy environments with the technologies of today and tomorrow. That's our goal. That's our standard that we try to follow. So I'll stop here and just say, I wanted to thank you all for taking the time to talk about COBOL and how it can be that right language to help you as you look to, digitally transform your own organizations. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days to listen in, and we would love to assist you in any ways that we can. And Amanda, as you say, if there are any more questions that come in, please don't hesitate to pass them on to me. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you at this point, Amanda.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to take a moment to remind you all about the CMG International Impact Conference. This year we will be in New Orleans in November. The conference will be November 6th through 9th at the Lowe's Hotel, and we're running tracks on performance, capacity, mainframe, and emerging technologies. We're really excited that in the next couple weeks we'll start releasing announcements of our speakers that have been selected for the conference. There are also a few additional things related to Impact. This year, we're really excited that we're going to be hosting a performance and capacity hackathon the weekend prior to Impact, also in New Orleans, but this is a new program for us, and there's opportunities to win cash prizes for the best performance and capacity solutions. So stay tuned for more information. We're going to be announcing challenges in the next month or so. And then we're also doing a badge program at Impact. So you have an opportunity to earn a digital badge through our training program. So you can learn more and see the speakers as they're announced at cmgimpact.com. And please let us know if you have any questions on that. And we look forward to seeing you in New Orleans. And with that, I believe we are wrapped up for today. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded. It's going to be featured on CMG's website, cmg.org, and you will also be able to access it through GT Software. So with that, thank you so much for your time today, and y'all have a great rest of the day.